Hello, Mind Testers. Welcome to Nodecast, the unofficial Minetest podcast. Episode 3, A Different Voice. I'm your host, ExeVirus, and I will be interviewing Mr. 56 Independent today. Before we get started, I want to say this interview was conducted quite untraditionally. We actually conducted it via email over the course of multiple days, and after a bunch of prodding, I was finally able to convince Mr. 56 to provide his wonderful voice to this episode. So, for all your enjoyment, you get to hear more than just my voice today. Alrighty, let's jump right into it. Mr. 56 Independent, where does your name come from?
When I was setting up my Gmail account, I had the arbitrary number 506 assigned to the end of my email address. I then took that number and prefixed it to an arbitrary word to make 506_independent. That was my username for a year, and I dropped the underscore. When I joined my first Minetest server, I was forced to use 2 digits and no underscores, so I dropped the 0 to make 56 independent. From there, it stuck. I use it everywhere now. Where did your name come from?
Well, my name was given to me by a friend back in, I think, 2011 or something. I was notorious for using a USB drive in school to run live Linux, specifically Knoppix, for those that know what Knoppix is, and carrying a bunch of Windows executables on that USB. It was mostly games and other fun stuff, and I'd put them on the computers I booted into. Some of the IT people thought it was a virus or something, putting the executables on the drive, so they basically blocked all .exe execution on the Windows for a couple days, thinking of them as viruses. This friend of mine was inspired by what happened and had to make a Steam account for me to play, I think, as Team Fortress 2, and I was going to visit him at his house. So, of course, he chose exe.virus as the name.
Very interesting. I've never been interested in hacking and thought it was overhyped. Being a sysadmin programmer, I make the stuff people hack into.
Don't worry, hacking is overhyped. And that's cool that you already have some system admin experience. So now that we know your name, what do you do? Something with system admin, I'm assuming.
I'm a 15-year-old in my final year of secondary school, and I would like a job which puts my sysadmin programmer skills to use. As a teenager, I am looking for a basic job in a local village, such as stacking shelves at the local supermarket. Growing up, I used the internet as a drug for happiness, which I still do. It goes faster than one can explore, meaning one has infinite wonder before themselves. I hope to find a way of monetizing my physical server.
I'm surprised to hear you say the internet is a drug, but still want to go into system admin and enjoy running your own server setup. I'm curious, so what ways do you find the internet can be healthy, and then what ways can it be unhealthy?
I was joking about the internet being a drug. In reality, it's a bit like fructose. Fine if taken in natural form and in context, but detrimental if taken in its refined, pure form. But yeah, compulsively seeking gratification in social media can't be good for you. But using it to learn how to make those social platforms is a much better use of time. Use the internet like fructose. Don't get the pure form and let social media put it on a conveyor belt to your mouth. Just select the finest foods on the infinite counter of search results and spend your time digesting those.
Well, that's a different analogy for the internet than I've ever heard, and a very reasonable outlook. As for search results, I personally have a vendetta against those search engines. They keep hiding Minetest when people search for free Minecraft, which, to be fair, were a lot more than an MC clone nowadays, but still just frustrating. Obviously, I found Minetest via the golden days of the search engine. How did you find Minetest?
I don't quite remember. When I was very young, I had this tablet and I was searching for Minecraft alternatives in the Google Play Store. I didn't even know what programming was back then. Although it might have been Final Minetest as there were pre-installed maps for me to try. Then, when I got my computer, I wanted games to pass the time, so after a few years of playing Worldcraft, I got Minetest. Details are patchy in my head, but I remember building a huge cart system running across the map, using the Advanced Range Tunnel Maker mod. Then, I built Miscon's Sandbox, and I remember doing repetitive work of a wall without having found the virtues of world editing tools. It was a fun world until it corrupted somehow. It was great trying out the mods.
World corruption is the bane of every good map's existence, sadly.
On a linguistically related note, I find Minetest to be a fun way to spend time administrating servers, building buildings, and making ideal transport networks, and all sorts of other fun things.
So I take it that you host your own server. Is it public? Tell us about it.
Yes, I do host my own server. I gave it the uninspiring name of 56i-empty server to describe ownership and purpose. It is still relatively new, at only 3 months, so I have no permanent players. But some players regular the server for a few days every now and then, but they never stay. At the time of speaking, I turn off the server as soon as I leave, and turn it back on when I want to join, which is slightly detrimental to my servers.minetest.net rating, and means that potential players often don't see my server. I now have 2 offshoot servers which use the current port forwarding errors to share a port. I have used Crontab to share time between each. One is a grim server where bombs fall all the time and scar the server, and the other is a desolate planet where there is nothing but you for kilometers all around. Back on my server, a lot of fun things happen. I have built small villages filled to the brim with wonder and state-of-the-art travel infrastructure. It does get a bit lonely, but that's fine. All of the popular servers I play on have been on the Minetest server scene for more than a year, and I'm sure server reforms will make my player count increase.
Wow, that takes some major commitment to keep at a server with such a few players. And yeah, being up all the time is helpful. It's also helpful to have something different that brings people back. You'll find there's a lot of survival and hangout and build servers, so keeping yourself unique can definitely be challenging, especially because you're not a modder. I'm curious if you have any quests or goals or design elements that you've used your villages for. Can you adopt a village? I'm imagining some tribes are forming or something like that.
It feels weird to call my settlements cities as they are so tiny, so I call them villages without meaning them as automatically generated towns. I would listen and explain all my settlements, then you'd die of boredom and me of oral fluid loss through speaking.
Thank you for not describing all of them. That's definitely something for our listeners to do on their own time if they want to learn your lore.
I will tell you the main thing which brings all the settlements together. The wiki. My wiki grows faster than a server, but only 1.1 times as fast. Wiki is used for planning, documenting, and replicating buildings throughout the server. There are no native populations, but I have written it in the wiki as a potential explanation to the dungeons on the server, an ancient nomad population building small dungeons throughout the server. My biggest goal for being on the server is that I just want to write a wiki, but specific to something. So I made a server for the wiki, just like Tolkien made Lord of the Rings, just to have a world for his conlangs. Without any players, it's like single player, just with lag. But to have a wiki from an public server feels slightly weird. As for my server's niche, I am taking another server's footsteps, and even my server tests an advanced trains-based mod. But the other server is stuck with a 20 node per second mod, whilst my mod has a configurable maximum speed. Whilst the mod will be in development for a long time, it is a promising enterprise. One that other servers would love to get their hands on.
Interestingly enough, I actually studied Tolkien in school, and I think your analogy is a perfect fit for what you're describing. Just remember, his world is loved because of the stories he made for his languages, so do press on with creating your world to be experienced. I had actually started to work on a decent NPC mod that lets you, in-game, create interactable entities that could populate the villages or provide more lore built into the server, rather than requiring the wiki to follow along. Maybe I should revisit that sometime soon. Anyways, not many players have interacted with advanced trains. Could you describe what all the mod lets you do?
Advanced Trains is brilliant. With a default carts mod, you can have slow carts going all over in realistic rails. With Advanced Trains, the turns are somewhat gentler, the tracks are wider, and the trains are enormous. It offers a full-blown interlocking system where routes are made manually, and is generally very complex and big. It can take months to get used to its intricacies. On other forums, you see new beginners always trying to find out new things about Advanced Trains because it's so complex. I love it because it's full of trains, something I like. It allows me to build grand train infrastructure, and it gives my villages a close connection with one another.
That's really cool. I could easily see players enjoying building their own massive transit systems that are more realistic. That's actually a lot of the real appeal of traditional Minecraft and Minetest modding, like MazeCons, Turmetal, TechAge, TechPack, Technic, Tinker's Construct, Digilines, you get it. They all have these challenging and rewarding progressions or systems you can build yourself in-game and create like this moving and breathing mechanized world. I'm excited to see your mod. On that subject, have you ever made your own mods before? Tell us about that experience.
I am developing a mod which introduces fire safety through the use of alarms and digger lines. I got as far as making the signs and some test textures for the items before I ran off to other hobbies. I would like to get something working on it as it is designed to save houses against fire. The modding environment is actually quite kind to me. I use a language a little like Python, and I get some helpful debug messages, and it is quite fun.
Yeah, Lua is pretty straightforward as languages go, and those line errors are extremely helpful. I'd be curious to see how your alarms could be abused for intruder alerts or something. There's a lot of fun to be had with such a system.
All the alarms do is detect the deadline signal and beep. You need smoke/heat detectors for detection. And these node-based games are barely worth a passing mention as they are so terrible. But the engine, wow, it's amazing. As discussed in the first episode, Irrelisk is getting old, but migrating to the Tux fork will introduce so many better features. I understand it's hard moving entirely from one library, so I propose this instead as a compromise. I would also like to see an increased consistency across everything, from variable names to item strings. From my vantage point, Minetest is going to become as inconsistent as PHP. I would also like an IDE with auto-completing functions for Minetest modding. I'd also like to see beginner-oriented games added, such as a tutorial and a sandbox with the most essential mods playing Minetest, away from default Minetest, which can be turned into another development/base game for people to build on with mods and use a minimal testing environment.
Wow, that's a good laundry list. Yeah, we are definitely moving towards switching engine backends, slowly but surely. It may even happen by the time this podcast hits a year old. At the very least, IRLict is being brought directly into our codebase, so we can better integrate and replace it piece by piece. As for PHP, I have run a few websites on it and know exactly what you're complaining about. There's a reason it has an 800-page reference manual for each revision. As for changing Minetest inconsistencies, the hard part is all the old mods will get broken when the names change. I guess we could do something like mark these functions as deprecated, implement a new name, redirect all the old ones to the new call, and then give a warning out to everybody who uses those old functions. We do that, I think, for alpha textures right now. And then either over time or in one fell swoop, we'll just remove the old functions. But honestly, Minetest isn't even that bad at names. I've seen plenty of other code bases, open source or otherwise, that suffer far worse naming issues than even we do. As to your mention of an IDE for Minetest, I recently discovered that you can have an IDE for Minetest. First off, you need to use Visual Studio Codium. And no, that's not Visual Studio, that Microsoft bloatware. Microsoft's Visual Studio Code is essentially a 100% open source, Electron-based IDE that comes with a large plugin repository. Electron is essentially packing your entire browser into an application and giving you more control to talk to your operating system, rather than the browser, which is kind of isolated. So VS Code looks as sleek as a website, but has the integrations of a traditional IDE. And as for the VS Code versus Codium part, the actual VS Code from Microsoft has telemetry and tracking enabled by default, and that turns it into not an open source project. So the actual download that you get from VS Code's website is a branded Microsoft product, not open source. Instead, you have to go to VS Codium people and download their version, which they have those brandings and telemetry disabled. The only drawback of doing all of that is that you can't use a traditional VS Code marketplace, and you have to use the open Visual Studio Code VSX repository. Anyways, once you finally do get Codium, here's all the tools that I use with Minetest to get it to become an IDE for Minetest. Number one is Minetest Tools by Green Zenith. That's an autocomplete plugin. Number two is CMake and CMake Tools plugins, Clang D language server, Lua language server by Sumneko. That provides your Lua IntelliSense, and a C++ native debugger. And that setup works for Windows, Linux, and Mac. It's 100% open source. And as for building on Minetest on Windows with that setup, I'll have to cover that in a different podcast. But it uses MSys for those of you that are gung-ho and want to do this on your own. Anyways, that Lua language server on VS Codium provides a full Lua IntelliSense for most mods. So if you see a function, you want to know more about what that function does, you can control-click the function. You'll be taken to where the definition is, rather than having to search through all these different files. It's super helpful. And as for your request for beginner games, trust me, I see what you mean. Onboarding is probably the most important part of getting players to join and stay within our community. And even intermediate onboarding is important. I suspect our modding and game-making community isn't that excited about explaining and teaching something they all know. But then again, there's a new project going on right now where they're trying to create a better modding documentation, so maybe what do I know? Anyways, great list. Sorry it shot me off on such a long tangent. I'm just excited that I found a cross-platform, open-source, easy setup for Minetest. Now, I asked about the future of Minetest. Do you have some final suggestions before we sign off, such as mods, servers, or games that you want our listeners to try?
I was thinking of a specialised IDE, not just extensions, but full-on JetBrains idea JFork for Minetest, where it's constantly telling you where the errors are. But your idea is still great, and I'm willing to use it, as are some of our listeners. And as for mods, I definitely like all the mods which automate things like Pipeworks, Technic, Miscons, his cousin Diglines, and Digatron, but I suspect most of our listeners already have these mods, and I might as well recommend mods which our view base has not heard of. As for those, I recommend BoostCarts, as they allow the carts mod to be propelled into the future, as well as Moose carts, as it has conductive rails allowing vehicle lines and the cart system to be merged. Another great mod is advanced trains, allowing cargo transport and passenger transport. I have built many passenger stations and some cargo terminals, and it is amazing. Carts can do the task, but not through unloaded map blocks, but advanced trains can. My favourite mods are ones that allow toys for daily lives to play with, like Mark III and Streets. They are amazing as they allow the Minetest game to be expanded far more through in-world scripts, or could even simulate Minetest for the porting of low grades. However, Dig Lines is very powerful. With the correct knowledge, an entire production chain can be automated. You can put raw material in one end and ask for the items being needed, and then use a single Lua controller with a super table of every crafting recipe inside and send it to an auto crafter. Then BAM! You have a block you need. Black magic.
I second boost carts. It's a must for any game with minecarts. I wasn't aware of Mezcon carts, so that's a simple and good idea. As for automating any node or item, I feel like that's what creative mode is for. But hey, go for it. Alright, we're out of time for now. Thank you, Mr. 56 Independent, for joining us today on Nodecast.
Thank you for inviting me. Good night all, and thanks for listening to our podcast.
So you just listened to my first text-based, post-recorded interview. Love it or hate it, I won't be using this format very often, as it's just not as lively as a traditional interview. Over the past few weeks, I've gotten multiple requests from you all about an RSS feed and a dedicated website for this podcast. I'll be trying to get that set up before the next episode releases, but please be patient with me. I barely have enough time to do these episodes, let alone time for learning how to set up an RSS feed. As for the next episode, keeping with the pattern of interview, self-hosted interview, I'll be self-hosting the next episode. I'll pick up where we left off with getting acquainted with Minetest. Now that you know where everyone is, we'll be diving into how you can contribute and make your own things in Minetest. Thanks for listening, and tune in later this month. Bye, everyone.